May 10, 1933. Berlin, Germany. Students in brown shirts carried armloads of books into Opernplatz, stacking them in pyramids while thousands gathered to watch. The air smelled of spring rain and anticipation. Joseph Goebbels stood at a microphone, his voice amplified across the square, declaring the death of un-German ideas. At precisely midnight, torches touched paper. Among the volumes consumed by flame were works of literature, philosophy, science. And tucked between banned texts, confiscated from record shops and private collections, were thousands of jazz recordings. Louis Armstrong. Duke Ellington. Benny Goodman. The crackle of shellac melting mixed with the roar of burning paper. The Nazi regime had declared jazz Entartete Musik, degenerate music. African rhythms, American improvisation, Jewish composers, all corrupting influences on German culture. The music itself was chaotic, undisciplined, sexually suggestive. It represented everything the Third Reich opposed. Order against chaos. Purity against contamination. Germanic precision against American excess. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary that jazz was the product of inferior races attempting to imitate European art forms. The result was noise, not music. Rhythm without structure. Emotion without discipline. He called it the sonic equivalent of modern art, deliberately ugly, intentionally offensive, designed to corrupt rather than elevate. By 1935, jazz performances were banned throughout Germany. Musicians who played American swing faced arrest. Radio stations that broadcast jazz lost their licenses. Record stores that sold jazz albums were shuttered. The purge extended across every territory Germany controlled. Austria, Czechoslovakia, eventually Poland and France. Wherever the Wehrmacht marched, jazz fell silent. The policy appeared successful. German youth instead heard military marches, Wagner operas, folk songs celebrating Aryan heritage. Cultural officers reported increased attendance at approved concerts. Citizens demonstrated proper enthusiasm for Germanic music. The corruption of jazz had been excised from the fatherland. German military leaders noted American cultural weakness with satisfaction. While Germany invested in discipline and martial spirit, America wasted energy on frivolous entertainment. Jazz clubs instead of rifle ranges. Dance halls instead of parade grounds. Saxophone players instead of soldiers. American morale, they concluded, was built on sand. When war came in September 1939, German confidence extended beyond military might to cultural superiority. Their soldiers marched to Beethoven. American soldiers, intelligence suggested, listened to improvised noise performed by undisciplined musicians. The contrast seemed absolute. Germany represented civilization. America represented decadence. The outcome, they believed, was predetermined. But in the autumn of 1941, something began transmitting from London that would challenge every assumption the Third Reich made about music, morale, and the American capacity for cultural warfare. November 15, 1941. London, England. Edward R. Murrow stood in a BBC broadcasting booth wearing headphones, waiting for his cue. Outside, the city still bore scars from the Blitz. Rubble piles where buildings once stood. Boarded windows. Empty spaces in familiar streets. But tonight's broadcast would not focus on destruction. It would introduce something new. The red light illuminated. Murrow spoke into the microphone with his characteristic gravity. He announced a new program beginning transmission across occupied Europe. Not news. Not propaganda speeches. Music. Specifically, American jazz. The Armed Forces Radio Service had partnered with the BBC to broadcast directly into Nazi-controlled territory. The signal would reach France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway. And Germany itself. Every night at midnight, when official radio stations went silent, the broadcasts would begin. 15 minutes of American jazz, followed by brief news updates in multiple languages, then more jazz. The selection that first night was deliberate. Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. Duke Ellington's Take the A Train. Not propaganda. Not messages about democracy or freedom. Just music. Pure, undiluted American swing, transmitted at sufficient power to override local jamming attempts. German authorities immediately recognized the threat. Within 48 hours, Goebbels issued directives to increase radio jamming across all frequencies. The penalty for listening to foreign broadcasts was increased from imprisonment to execution. Radio detection vans began patrolling German cities at night, using directional antennas to identify households receiving BBC transmissions. Loudspeakers mounted on vehicles broadcast warnings about the dangers of enemy propaganda. The response revealed something the Nazi leadership had not anticipated. You could ban jazz recordings. You could arrest jazz musicians. You could close jazz clubs. But you could not stop radio waves. The music transmitted regardless of laws, regardless of borders, regardless of ideology. It simply existed in the air, waiting for anyone brave enough to turn a dial. In Paris, a 17-year-old student named Henri Cartier sat in his apartment on Rue de la Huchette with curtains drawn and lights off. His father's radio, pre-war Telefunken, could receive shortwave frequencies if positioned correctly. He adjusted the dial slowly, moving through static until he found it. First crackling, then clear. A trumpet, bright and urgent. Louis Armstrong's West End Blues. Henri had never heard anything like it. The music was illegal. Possessing a radio capable of receiving foreign broadcasts was illegal. Being awake after curfew was illegal. But Henri listened. The trumpet seemed to mock every rule the occupation had imposed. Its improvisation denied the existence of rigid control. Its joy contradicted the mandated German seriousness. Its freedom existed regardless of political reality. Across occupied France, similar scenes repeated. In Lyon, a factory worker pressed his ear against a speaker, volume barely audible, listening to Artie Shaw. In Brussels, a teacher made notes on compositions, analyzing arrangements he would reconstruct from memory. In Amsterdam, teenagers gathered in basements, taking turns with headphones, passing around the sound of Count Basie's piano like contraband. The Germans responded with increased penalties. Radio possession checks became routine. Informants reported neighbors. Executions for radio crimes increased. Yet the listening continued. Because the music offered something no amount of propaganda or punishment could eliminate. Proof that another world existed beyond occupation, beyond control, beyond the present moment of defeat. The broadcasts expanded. By early 1942, jazz transmissions reached audiences in Italy, Poland, Yugoslavia. The Armed Forces Radio Service established more powerful transmitters in North Africa, increasing signal strength into southern Europe. The BBC added French, Dutch, and Danish language announcers between musical segments. The format remained consistent. Jazz, news, more jazz. Simple. Effective. Unstoppable. In Washington, the Office of War Information analyzed the program's impact. Reports from resistance networks indicated the broadcasts were having effects beyond entertainment. Morale among occupied populations measurably improved. German jamming efforts absorbed resources needed elsewhere. Most significantly, captured German soldiers increasingly admitted to listening to the broadcasts themselves. Secretly. Against orders. Despite knowing the penalty. The irony was profound. Germany had banned jazz as degenerate, as evidence of American cultural weakness. But that same degenerate music was now the most potent weapon in the American psychological warfare arsenal. Not because it contained propaganda. But because it didn't. It simply existed as itself. Free, improvisational, undisciplined, joyful. Everything fascism could not tolerate. And then, in the summer of 1942, the stakes increased dramatically when the U.S. Army decided to send the music directly into combat. June 1942. Maxwell Field, Alabama. Captain Glenn Miller, age 38, stood at attention in a quartermaster's office while an Army clerk processed his enlistment papers. Civilian occupation, band leader. Prior service, none. Musical qualifications, 17 gold records, numerous film appearances, leader of the most successful dance band in America. Assignment pending. Miller had tried enlisting in the Navy but was rejected for being too old. The Army accepted him with a simple condition. He would form and lead a military band designed specifically for morale operations and armed forces entertainment. Not a traditional military band playing marches. A jazz orchestra. Playing swing. For soldiers overseas, the concept faced immediate opposition. Army traditionalists argued that military bands should maintain dignity and martial discipline. Proper military music meant Sousa marches and patriotic anthems. Jazz was informal, improvisational, unsuitable for military representation. One colonel wrote in a memo that allowing jazz into the armed forces would undermine the seriousness of the war effort. But Army Morale Division analysts had studied the BBC broadcasts. They examined reports from North Africa where British forces deployed entertainment units. They reviewed psychological studies on music's effect on soldier performance. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Jazz improved morale more effectively than any other musical form. Soldiers requested it. Soldiers responded to it. Soldiers needed it. Miller received authorization to form the Army Air Forces Orchestra. He was given recruiting authority to draft musicians directly from civilian bands. Within 6 weeks, he assembled 42 musicians, most drafted directly from major orchestras. The talent level was extraordinary. These were professional musicians at peak ability, now wearing uniforms. Training began at Yale University, where the band rehearsed 12 hours daily. Miller adapted his civilian arrangements for military performances. Faster tempos. Tighter harmonies. More energy. The music had to work in outdoor venues, over poor audio systems, for audiences of thousands. It had to compete with aircraft noise, artillery fire, and the general chaos of war zones. The first overseas deployment came in June 1944. Miller and his orchestra flew to England, establishing headquarters at Bedford. Their mission was explicit. Perform for troops before D-Day. Boost morale ahead of the invasion. Make sure every soldier going into France knew that America was behind them, not just with weapons and supplies, but with music. The performances were unlike anything the army had attempted before. Miller's orchestra played for 5,000 soldiers at a time in Quonset huts and outdoor amphitheaters. No formal seating. Men stood, packed shoulder to shoulder, often still covered in mud from training exercises. The band would launch into "In the Mood," and the response was instantaneous. Thousands of soldiers moving together, smiling, forgetting for 30 minutes that some of them would be dead within weeks. Between June and September 1944, Miller's orchestra performed over 800 concerts. They broadcast on Armed Forces Radio 6 times weekly. Their programs reached estimated audiences of 20 million, including troops in Pacific, Mediterranean, and European theaters. German forces also listened. Radio intercepts confirmed German soldiers tuning to American broadcasts specifically for Miller's band. The German response revealed strategic miscalculation. Nazi cultural authorities had assumed that banning jazz would make populations immune to its influence. Instead, the ban created mystique. Forbidden music was desirable music. Soldiers who had never heard jazz while civilians in Germany became curious about what made it dangerous enough to prohibit. Wehrmacht reports from late 1944 noted declining morale among troops in France. Multiple factors contributed. Allied air superiority. Supply shortages. Deteriorating strategic position. But intelligence officers noted an unexpected element. German soldiers were increasingly found with American jazz recordings taken from captured positions. Some units held secret listening sessions when officers were absent. The music represented something their indoctrination had not prepared them for. American confidence. American energy. American refusal to take the war seriously in the way Germans did. This was psychological warfare at its purest. Not convincing the enemy that their cause was wrong, but demonstrating that the American cause was built on something deeper than ideology. Jazz represented improvisation, individual expression within group harmony, freedom that still functioned. Everything about it contradicted fascist aesthetics. And soldiers on both sides understood what that meant. In October 1944, Miller's orchestra relocated to Paris. The city had been liberated 2 months earlier. Miller wanted to perform there, to bring jazz back to its spiritual home in Europe. The concerts in Paris drew audiences of French civilians and Allied soldiers together. Standing ovations lasted 15 minutes. People wept openly. Not because the music was sad. Because it represented the end of occupation. The return of culture. The victory over silence. Miller wrote home that the concerts in Paris were the most important work he had ever done. More meaningful than any civilian performance, any gold record, any radio show. Because here the music was not entertainment. It was evidence. Proof that civilization had not been extinguished. That beauty still existed. That Americans brought not just firepower but joy. But morale operations extended beyond concert halls. The Armed Forces radio service was broadcasting jazz into Germany itself, directly into the heart of enemy territory, targeting civilian populations and soldiers alike. And what began as entertainment was becoming something more dangerous. A vision of what peace might offer. A promise that defeat did not mean annihilation. February 1943. Berlin, Germany. Frau Gertrud Hoffman sat in her apartment kitchen at 11:45 p.m., lights off, curtains drawn. On the table before her sat a Volksempfänger radio, the people's receiver, that every German household was required to own. The device was designed with limited range, unable to receive foreign broadcasts under normal circumstances. But Gertrud's husband, an electrical engineer killed at Stalingrad 3 months earlier, had modified the set before deployment. A few changed resistors, a rewired antenna. Now it could receive London. She waited until midnight, then adjusted the dial. Static, German jamming signal, then through the interference, clear for just a moment, the opening bars of Moonlight Serenade. Glenn Miller. She turned the volume low, barely audible, and listened. This was her nightly ritual. Her private act of resistance. Not political. She did not tune in for news or propaganda. Just the music. 15 minutes of American jazz that represented everything the regime had taken from her. Joy. Freedom. The simple pleasure of music that made you want to move instead of march. Across Berlin, similar risks repeated in darkened rooms. A factory worker in Kreuzberg. A shopkeeper in Charlottenburg. A student in Schönberg. Each listening alone, in secret, knowing that discovery meant imprisonment or execution. The Gestapo maintained special units for radio crimes. Detection vans patrolled at night, using directional equipment to identify illegal listening. Apartment buildings had informants. Neighbors reported neighbors. The penalty was certain. Yet the listening continued. Why risk death for music? The question itself revealed what the Nazi leadership misunderstood about cultural control. They assumed banning jazz eliminated desire for jazz. In reality, prohibition created obsession. What you cannot have becomes what you need most. The music represented escape not because of what it was, but because of what it was not. Not military. Not propaganda. Not German. In Bavaria, a 19-year-old Wehrmacht soldier named Hans Schroeder returned home on leave in March 1943. His unit had been rotated back from the Eastern Front after suffering 60% casualties in fighting around Kharkov. He had 3 weeks before returning to combat. His mother asked what he wanted to do during his leave. He said he wanted to hear American jazz. His mother was horrified. Jazz was forbidden. Listening was treason. Hans told her he had heard it on the front. Captured radios sometimes picked up Soviet broadcasts that included American music. The men in his unit listened when officers were not present. It helped. He could not explain exactly how. It just did. It made the war feel less total, less absolute. Like the world contained possibilities beyond survival and death. Hans's mother refused. But his sister, 16 years old, understood. She knew someone who knew someone. By 1943, underground jazz networks operated in major German cities. Not organized resistance. Just individuals who traded recordings, copied sheet music, held secret listening sessions. The risk was extraordinary. The Gestapo classified jazz activity as Wehrkraftzersetzung, undermining military morale. Execution was standard punishment. 3 days into his leave, Hans attended a gathering in a basement in Munich. 7 people, mostly teenagers. One had a phonograph and a collection of pre-war recordings smuggled home from Paris before the ban. Dizzy Gillespie. Charlie Parker. Art Tatum. The volume was kept low, barely audible 3 feet from the speaker. They listened in complete silence, eyes closed, absorbing music that had been declared non-existent by their government. Hans returned to the front 2 weeks later. He was killed near Kursk in July 1943. His sister kept attending the underground listening sessions. After the war, she told an interviewer that those gatherings were the only moments during the Nazi period when she felt completely free. Not because the music was political. Because it existed outside politics entirely. It was pure. Human. Uncorrupted by ideology. The Gestapo eventually discovered the Munich group. Arrests came in November 1943. 5 members were sent to concentration camps. 2 were executed. But new groups formed. The network was decentralized, impossible to eliminate completely. For every gathering broken up, 2 more appeared. Jazz had become more than music. It was proof that total control was impossible. That human beings would always seek what authorities forbade. That culture was stronger than law. In occupied France, the dynamic was different but equally significant. French jazz culture had flourished before the war. Django Reinhardt, Stéphane Grappelli, countless clubs in Paris. The Nazi occupation attempted to eliminate this, classifying jazz as Jewish degenerate art. Many musicians fled. Others went underground. But a curious thing happened. German soldiers stationed in Paris sought out the forbidden music. Reports from French resistance networks documented German officers attending secret jazz performances. Officers who officially enforced the ban privately violated it. They knew the risks. They came anyway. Some claimed they attended to monitor potential resistance activity. But witnesses noted they stayed longer than surveillance required. They ordered drinks. They tapped their feet. They sometimes requested specific songs. The contradiction became obvious. The same military that banned jazz could not stop its own soldiers from seeking it out. Cultural control had limits. Orders could govern behavior but not desire. The music continued existing in the space between official policy and human need. By late 1944, German morale reports showed measurable decline. Multiple factors contributed. Military defeats. Allied bombing. Supply shortages. But internal security reports also noted increased incidents of defeatist cultural contamination. Soldiers were listening to enemy radio. Civilians were attending underground jazz gatherings. Young people were deliberately adopting American cultural markers as acts of rebellion against the regime. The Nazi cultural project had failed completely. They had banned the music. But they had only increased its power. What was merely entertainment before the war had become symbol of everything fascism could not control. Freedom, improvisation, individual expression, joy despite circumstances. The music was winning not because it contained messages, but because it existed as itself. Alive, undisciplined, impossible to eliminate. And in December 1944, when Allied forces were pushing into Germany itself, they brought with them something no Wehrmacht defense could stop. Not tanks or aircraft. Sound trucks broadcasting jazz at maximum volume directly into German lines. December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The German offensive began at 5:30 a.m. with artillery barrage across 80 miles of front. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The final desperate gamble. 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, driving through fog and snow toward the Meuse River. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For the first 3 days, German forces made significant progress. Allied lines buckled. Communications broke down. Weather prevented air support. German commanders reported the offensive was ahead of schedule. Their soldiers advanced with renewed confidence. This was their chance to reverse the war's momentum. But on the 4th day, something unexpected appeared behind advancing German columns. American psychological warfare units deploying specialized equipment. Loudspeaker trucks. Mobile radio transmitters. Sound amplification systems powerful enough to broadcast across miles of battlefield. The equipment was marked with Psychological Warfare Division insignia. The operators were trained in acoustic warfare. And their weapon was music. At 3 p.m. on December 20th, the first broadcasts began. Not propaganda speeches. Not surrender appeals. Jazz. Glenn Miller's String of Pearls. Broadcast at volume levels that carried over artillery fire, through forest, across snow-covered fields. German soldiers heard it in their foxholes. Officers heard it in command posts. Entire battalions stopped fighting temporarily, confused by what they were hearing. The tactic was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. The broadcasts accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. First, they demonstrated American technological superiority. Equipment capable of broadcasting at such volume indicated resources, organization, capability. Second, they disrupted German morale by presenting the conflict's absurdity. While German soldiers fought desperately in freezing conditions, Americans had leisure to broadcast music. Third, and most significantly, the music itself carried meaning that transcended propaganda. Jazz represented everything the offensive was supposed to deny. American strength, American confidence, American certainty of victory. The music did not argue for surrender. It simply existed as evidence that German defeat was inevitable. Why else would Americans waste resources broadcasting music in the middle of battle? The very act suggested they considered the outcome predetermined. German reaction revealed how effectively the tactic worked. Wehrmacht reports from the Ardennes described growing confusion among troops. Soldiers questioned why they were advancing if Americans were confident enough to broadcast entertainment. Some units refused to continue fighting until officers silenced the broadcasts. But you cannot shoot radio waves. The music continued regardless of orders. Oberst Friedrich Weber, commanding a Panzergrenadier regiment, wrote in his diary that the broadcasts created an atmosphere of unreality among his men. They were fighting through frozen forests, outnumbered, undersupplied, watching their comrades die. And through the trees came saxophone and trumpet, clear and joyful, suggesting that somewhere nearby Americans were not even taking the war seriously. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. On December 23, weather cleared and Allied aircraft resumed operations. German offensive momentum collapsed. But the broadcasts continued. By now, psychological warfare division units were deploying loudspeaker trucks across the entire Western Front. Broadcasts were coordinated with tactical operations. Before an attack, music. During fighting, strategic silence. After victory, triumphant jazz. The sound became Pavlovian trigger. Jazz meant American advance. Silence meant German retreat. German High Command recognized the problem. Goebbels issued directives ordering troops to ignore enemy broadcasts. Unit commanders were instructed to disable radio equipment and loudspeakers wherever possible. Penalties for listening to enemy transmissions were increased. But enforcement became impossible under combat conditions. You could not simultaneously fight a battle and police soldiers hearing. Intelligence intercepts revealed captured German prisoners asking about specific jazz recordings. Where did Americans obtain such music? Who were the musicians? Could recordings be purchased after the war? The questions demonstrated complete psychological capitulation. German soldiers were no longer asking whether they would lose, but what they would do afterward. The music had become promise of future rather than present enemy. In January 1945, as German forces retreated from the Ardennes, American broadcast units followed, maintaining constant pressure. Music at dawn. Music at dusk. Music through the night. In the mood. Take the A train. Begin the Begin. The same recordings, repeated deliberately, becoming sonic landscape of defeat. Every German soldier retreating from Belgium heard jazz. Every soldier crossing back into Germany carried that sound in memory. The strategic impact was measurable. Wehrmacht morale reports from January 1945 showed unprecedented levels of defeatism. Desertion rates increased 300%. Surrender rates increased 400%. Multiple factors contributed, but psychological warfare units specifically noted the role of music broadcasts. Soldiers surrendering to American forces frequently mentioned the broadcasts. Some said they had been listening for months. Others said hearing the music during combat broke their will to continue fighting. This was not propaganda in traditional sense. No one claimed jazz convinced German soldiers that National Socialism was wrong or democracy was right. But the music demonstrated something more fundamental. That American morale was unshakable. That American resources were unlimited. That American confidence was justified. These truths rendered continued fighting pointless. Why die for a cause that even your enemies mock through music? The broadcasts had transformed jazz from entertainment into weapon. Not metaphorical weapon. Actual tactical asset deployed in combat operations. And it was working with effectiveness that conventional propaganda could never achieve. Because the music did not argue. It simply existed. Joyful, confident, free. Everything the Third Reich had tried to destroy. Everything that would outlast fascism. By March 1945, American forces were crossing the Rhine. And broadcasting jazz from speakers mounted on Sherman tanks as they rolled through German villages. The sound of liberation was not speeches or declarations. It was Benny Goodman's clarinet, cutting through smoke and ruins, announcing that the silence was over. April 1945. Frankfurt, Germany. American forces entered the city after 3 days of fighting. Resistance had been light. Most Wehrmacht units had withdrawn east. Those remaining surrendered quickly. By evening, military government detachments were establishing control over intact districts. And with them came broadcast units, psychological warfare division vehicles equipped with loudspeakers and records. Sergeant Robert Martinez, 23 years old from El Paso, operated a sound truck assigned to Hauptwacht district. His orders were simple. Broadcast music and announcements to civilian population. Inform them of occupation regulations. Maintain order through continuous presence. He parked his vehicle in a square surrounded by damaged buildings and started the first recording. Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady. The reaction was immediate but not what he expected. People emerged from basements and ruins, not fleeing but approaching. Germans who had spent weeks sheltering from bombardment now walked toward American music playing from military speakers. Some were crying. Many stood silently, just listening. An older woman approached Martinez and asked in broken English if he could play it again. He did. This scene repeated across Germany in April and May 1945. As American forces occupied cities and towns, jazz broadcasts became part of occupation routine. Not punishment. Not propaganda. Just music, constant and public, marking the change in authority. The sound that had been forbidden for 12 years was now government policy. Loudspeakers mounted on buildings. Radio stations ordered to broadcast American programming. Every public space filled with music the Nazis had declared degenerate. For Germans who had secretly listened during the war, the change was profound. Music that had required darkness and risk now played in daylight. What had been crime was now ordinary. The reversal revealed how completely the Reich had fallen. Its laws were void. Its prohibitions meaningless. The music played because the power that banned it no longer existed. In Berlin, Soviet forces arrived first and established their occupation zone. No jazz broadcasts there. Soviet military bands played classical music and folk songs. But in Western sectors controlled by Americans, British, and French, jazz became the soundtrack of occupation. Mobile broadcast units traveled through ruins, speakers announcing regulations in German followed by American swing. The contrast between sectors was absolute. Soviet zone had order and silence. Western zones had chaos and music. Young Germans gravitated toward Western sectors specifically for the music. Teenagers who had grown up under Prohibition now heard jazz freely for the first time. They did not understand the historical significance. They simply knew it represented something new. Something not German. Something that suggested future might be different from past. Allied psychological warfare units studied the response carefully. Reports noted that jazz broadcasts reduced resistance to occupation, increased cooperation with military government, and generally improved relations between occupying forces and civilian population. The music functioned as soft power. Not forcing compliance but creating atmosphere where compliance seemed natural. Because the alternative was return to silence, return to prohibition, return to the regime that had failed. In Nuremberg, where war crimes trials began in November 1945, American forces network broadcast jazz during court recesses. The music played through speakers in the Palace of Justice, audible in courtrooms and surrounding streets. Nazi defendants heard it during breaks between testimony about genocide and war crimes. The irony was deliberate. The regime that had banned this music as degenerate was being judged while that same music played openly. Cultural victory paralleling legal judgment. German musicians began reforming jazz groups, tentatively at first. Pre-war players who had survived came out of hiding. Young musicians who had learned secretly began performing publicly. By late 1945, jazz clubs were opening in Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt. Not sophisticated venues. Basements and damaged buildings. Makeshift stages and salvaged instruments. But the music was live. Real. German musicians playing American jazz for German audiences. The cycle was beginning again. Allied authorities initially debated whether to permit this. Some argued that Germans should not be allowed to play jazz, that it was American culture and Germans had forfeited the right to participate. Others recognized the strategic value. German jazz musicians represented cultural rehabilitation. They were Germans choosing American culture over German cultural nationalism. They were living proof that the Nazi cultural project had failed completely. By 1946, German jazz was flourishing in occupied zones. Hot clubs packed with young Germans listening to local musicians play American standards. The style was different from American jazz. More restrained. More technical. Less improvisational. But it was jazz. And its existence in Germany less than a year after total military defeat demonstrated something remarkable. Culture could not be killed. Music survived ideology. What had been banned had returned stronger. The transformation was not limited to Germany. Across Europe, jazz was experiencing renaissance. Paris clubs reopened, now packed with Americans and French together. London jazz scene exploded with new talent. Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Brussels, all saw jazz culture return and expand. The music had survived the war. More than survived. It had been validated. The side that had embraced jazz won. The side that had banned it lost. The conclusion seemed obvious. But the real legacy was emerging not in Europe but in places jazz had never penetrated before. American occupation forces in Japan brought jazz to Tokyo. Military bases in the Philippines broadcast jazz to Asian audiences. Armed forces radio stations in the Pacific transmitted jazz across thousands of miles of ocean. The music that had been weapon in European war was becoming cultural export to entire world. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. Freedom sounds like this. 1946, New York City. Benny Goodman stood in Carnegie Hall, leading his orchestra through Sing, 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 before an audience that included returning soldiers, European refugees, and civilians who had waited years for live performances to resume. The venue was sold out. People sat in aisles, stood in balconies, pressed against walls. The war was over. Jazz had won. But that victory felt incomplete to many who had experienced the war directly. Glenn Miller was dead, his aircraft lost over the English Channel in December 1944. He never saw Germany's surrender, never learned that the music he helped weaponize had contributed to the psychological collapse he predicted. His orchestra disbanded. His recordings remained. But the man himself was gone, disappeared into cold water, another casualty listed as missing. Other musicians had returned changed. Men who deployed with entertainment units came home with different understanding of music's purpose. They had seen what jazz accomplished in combat. How it sustained morale. How it disrupted enemies. How it represented something more than entertainment. That knowledge stayed with them. When they performed after the war, the music carried weight it hadn't before. Dizzy Gillespie, who had performed for troops in the Pacific, later said the war taught him that jazz was political whether musicians wanted it to be or not. The Nazis banned it because they understood its implications. Improvisation implied freedom of individual within collective. Syncopation implied disruption of established rhythm. African influences implied racial equality. The music itself was argument against fascism. Not metaphorical argument. Structural argument embedded in how the music functioned. This recognition changed jazz in the post-war period. Musicians became more experimental, more willing to push boundaries, more conscious that their art carried cultural meaning beyond entertainment. Bebop emerged partly from this consciousness. The style was deliberately difficult, intentionally inaccessible, a rejection of commercial jazz that had served military purposes. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk created music that could not be used, could not be deployed, could not be simplified into propaganda. It existed purely as art, resisting appropriation. But even as artists pushed away from wartime jazz, the general public embraced it more completely. Jazz became American classical music in popular consciousness. Not degenerate art. Not minority culture. National sound. Evidence of democratic vitality. When Voice of America began broadcasting globally in 1947, jazz comprised 60% of music programming. When State Department launched cultural diplomacy programs, jazz musicians were selected as ambassadors. The music that Nazis had banned as evidence of American weakness became proof of American strength. In Germany, the transformation was even more striking. German youth adopted jazz as rebellion against their parents' generation. The music represented rejection of nationalism, embrace of internationalism, repudiation of the values that had led to catastrophe. By 1950, West German radio broadcast more jazz than German folk music. Jazz clubs in Berlin and Munich attracted larger audiences than classical concerts. The cultural shift was complete and irreversible. Soviet authorities watched this with concern. In their occupation zone, later East Germany, jazz remained controlled. Not banned as Nazis had banned it, but limited, regulated, approved. Only certain styles. Only certain musicians. Jazz that sounded too American or too improvisational was discouraged. The cultural divide between East and West Germany was audible. One side swung. One side did not. This pattern repeated globally as Cold War developed. Jazz became marker of freedom versus control. Countries aligned with America heard unrestricted jazz. Countries aligned with Soviet Union heard restricted jazz or none at all. The music itself became ideological divider. Not because musicians intended this, but because the music's fundamental nature was incompatible with authoritarian control. You could have jazz or you could have total state power. But you could not have both completely. For individuals who had secretly listened during the war, the aftermath brought different emotions. Gertrud Hoffman, who had risked execution to hear Glenn Miller on illegal radio in Berlin, emigrated to Chicago in 1948. She told an interviewer that she could never hear jazz the same way again. It was no longer just music. It was a reminder of risks she took, of fear she felt, of nights waiting for broadcasts while her neighbors slept. Every trumpet note carried memory of defiance. Every rhythm recalled the choice between safety and beauty. Thousands of veterans carried similar associations. Jazz was not entertainment for them. It was soundtrack to specific experiences. Memories of waiting to go into combat. Relief of surviving. Grief for those who didn't. The music linked to moments that could not be fully communicated to those who had not experienced them. When these men heard jazz after the war, they heard other things underneath. Artillery. Engine noise. Fear. Relief. The music had been present for events that defined their lives. It would always carry that weight. By 1950, American jazz had become a global phenomenon. Musicians from Japan, France, Norway, Brazil, Cuba were playing American standards and creating new variations. The style was adapting, incorporating local influences, becoming international language while maintaining American roots. This was cultural imperialism to critics. Cultural democracy to supporters. Either way, it was reality. The music had spread beyond any possibility of containment. And somewhere in that transformation, the connection to war began fading. New audiences heard jazz without knowing it had been weapon. Younger musicians played without understanding what the music had accomplished in combat. The styles evolved beyond wartime swing into bebop, cool jazz, modal jazz, free jazz. Each generation pushed further from the sound that had broadcast through ruins and across battlefields. The music continued. But memory of what it had done grew distant. Yet for those who remembered, the meaning remained. Jazz had defeated fascism alongside tanks and aircraft. Not because it convinced anyone of political truth. But because it existed as itself. Free, improvisational, joyful, impossible to control completely. That existence was victory more profound than military conquest. It was proof that culture was stronger than ideology. That beauty outlasted power. That the side which banned music could never win against the side that created it. 1959, Moscow. American jazz musicians performed in the Soviet Union for the first time as part of State Department Cultural Exchange Program. Benny Goodman's orchestra played in Leningrad and Moscow to audiences who had never heard American jazz live. The concerts were political events. Cultural warfare without weapons. Democracy versus communism, performed through music. Soviet audiences responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. Standing ovations. Encores demanded until exhaustion forced the musicians to stop. Young Soviets asked how they could learn to play like this, where they could obtain recordings, whether American musicians would return. The concerts demonstrated what Nazi Germany had learned 20 years earlier. You could not ban culture more appealing than what you offered in its place. Prohibition only increased desire. The tour was triumph of exactly what World War II had proven. Jazz was weapon. Not because it attacked. Because it attracted. It offered something authoritarian systems could not duplicate. Individual freedom within collective structure. Discipline through improvisation. Order achieved through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed control. These were not just musical principles. They were political ones. And everyone watching understood that. But this legacy was not the one jazz musicians always welcomed. Many resented being used as propaganda, as tools of government policy. They had not created this music to serve political purposes. Yet the music's very existence served political purposes whether they intended it or not. Jazz could not be separated from what it represented. That was both its power and its burden. In Germany, the transformation jazz accomplished was now complete. Two German states existed, divided by ideology and by wall. West Germany had fully embraced American culture, including jazz. Clubs, festivals, radio programs, all celebrating music that had been banned a generation earlier. East Germany permitted jazz but controlled it, limited it, subjected it to ideological review. The musical difference was audible proof of political difference. Former German soldiers occasionally spoke about hearing jazz during the war. Usually late in life, when distance from events made honesty possible. They described listening to armed forces radio in secret. Hearing broadcasts from loudspeakers during retreat. The music had stayed with them. Some said it convinced them the war was lost. Others said it simply made them want to survive long enough to hear more. Either way, it had affected them. Made them see beyond propaganda. Made them recognize something in the enemy beyond simple opposition. American soldiers who had operated psychological warfare broadcasts also spoke, though less publicly. They described satisfaction in their work. Knowing the music reached people. Seeing captured prisoners who hummed American songs. The broadcasts had been more than military duty. They had been cultural mission. Spreading something valuable, something beautiful, into darkness. Not many military tasks could claim that. The musicians themselves rarely discussed the war's impact on their art. Glenn Miller was dead. Others had moved on to new styles, new challenges. But occasionally, in interviews or private conversations, they acknowledged what had occurred. Jazz had been tested against fascism and had won. Not through military force. Through cultural force. Through being itself so completely that opposition could not withstand it. By the 1960s, jazz was evolving beyond its wartime identity. Free jazz, fusion, avant-garde experimentation. Younger musicians deliberately broke from the swing style that had served military purposes. They were not interested in entertainment or cultural diplomacy. They wanted art that challenged, that provoked, that refused easy consumption. Jazz was becoming what it always had been before the war made it weapon. Just music. Pure creative expression, independent of political purpose. Yet the historical legacy remained. High school history books began including sections on cultural aspects of World War II. Jazz received mention alongside Rosie the Riveter and War Bonds. Not just entertainment. Part of the war effort. Students learned that America had won through industrial might, military skill, and cultural appeal. Jazz represented that third element. Proof that American way of life was worth defending because it produced culture worth experiencing. Scholars debated the significance. Some argued jazz's role was minor compared to military operations. Others claimed cultural factors were decisive in maintaining morale and breaking enemy resistance. The truth likely existed between extremes. Jazz mattered. But it mattered alongside everything else. No single element won the war. But every element contributed, including saxophone players and trumpet sections broadcasting through ruins. The veterans who had listened to jazz during the war were aging now. The men who had crouched in foxholes hearing Glenn Miller from distant radios. The women who had secretly tuned to BBC broadcasts in occupied Europe. They remembered what the music had meant. How it had provided hope, or escape, or simply evidence that another world existed beyond present horror. Those memories were personal, not transferable. When these people died, their specific understanding of what jazz accomplished would die with them. But recordings remained. The same recordings that had broadcast into combat zones were now archived, preserved, available to anyone. In the mood. Take the A Train. String of Pearls. Music that once served as psychological warfare was now simply American cultural heritage. Students could listen to it without knowing what it had done. Musicians could play it without understanding what it had represented. And perhaps that was appropriate. The music had done its work. It had served purposes its creators never imagined. It had survived attempts to destroy it and had outlasted the regime that tried. Now it could return to being what it always wanted to be. Just music. Beautiful, joyful, free. Available to anyone willing to listen. But for those who remembered, who had been present when jazz was weapon rather than entertainment, the sound would always carry additional meaning. Every note contained history. Every rhythm recalled specific moments when music mattered more than anyone who had not been there could understand. They heard the past in every performance. And in hearing the past, they remembered the lesson that past had taught. Some things cannot be banned. Some forms of expression are stronger than the power that tries to silence them. Culture outlasts ideology. Beauty defeats control. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon in war is not gun or bomb but something as simple and profound as a saxophone playing late at night, transmitting through darkness, telling everyone who hears it that there is another way to live. The music plays still.